Yeah, this is video number 3. And, well, a friend of mine asked me why my videos kind of, I kind of sound a little bit incoherent when I talk about this, or it's kind of like, it's all over the place. And the reason it's all over the place is I'll kind of explain before I do kind of chase off the video here. Basically, what I do is something I want to talk about, I get, like, really into it, and for a week, I basically watch, play video games, watch that show, just kind of really get into it. And then the last day, I have a complete geek fest. I mean, video games, anime. I go nuts before I do the video. Get myself to a point where I'm half awake, half asleep, and just like I'm feeling so tired I'm gonna fall asleep. Then I drink a crap load of coffee, and then I have at her, and I do the video. And trust me, when I say, you know how those eyes are there? Yeah, that's probably what my eyes look like right now because I've just had that much coffee. I just kind of like go completely insane. And then originally, what I was actually going to call this was actually the game insomnia, but I decided to, because I'm going to do more than just, video games. I want to do sci-fi, fantasy, and all the other fun stuff. So I just decided to name it what I named it now. So here we go. What am I going to talk about? Well, as I look and notice, it's kind of a little bit cold outside, and I'm all alone, more or less. Yeah, that's right. I'm going to talk about Red Dwarf. I think one of the greatest sci-fi shows of all time. It definitely adds to my Seven Saints of sci-fi. What am I talking about? The Seven Saints. I believe there are 7 things in this world. To all things you just have to play. If you're a geek and you consider yourself a fan, like a real fan, you have to have at least seen one of these 7 things. You have to have at least done that, or you can't consider yourself you can't consider yourself a fan. Even like considering yourself a hardcore fan or a light fan, you have to consider yourself that. You have to have at least seen this. And it's on my top list. And people are probably wondering, well, why are you calling your top list? Why not Star Trek? Well, to be perfectly honest, Red Dwarf was actually my first sci-fi. Yeah, I know, that's kind of weird, eh? The first actual sci-fi was the show that was shown late night on PBS. Yeah, it was basically that one thing. And, when I first watched it as a kid, I was like, I never knew really what sci-fi was. Unless you count He-Man and maybe some of the anime I was watching, I really didn't know what sci-fi was. I hadn't seen Star Trek yet. I didn't see Star Trek until I was like at least, at least 12, maybe 13 was the first time I actually watched sci-fi. Actually watched that sci-fi series, Star Trek. And Star Wars, same thing. It was like 12, 13 maybe. So it was just kind of one of those things that I never really got into. So I didn't really get into it, really didn't know it existed, really didn't have control of the TV, so it just kind of, I never really got into it. But, when late night rolled around, I would sneak out of bed and, turn on the Red Dwarf, and, them's history for me when me and sci-fi. So, well, yeah, it's kind of that again, it is that love, it is a nostalgia boner for me. So I did decide to start watching it, and well, I'm gonna talk about it now. First thing I gotta talk about is the cast. you know what can I say about a series that originally started with 4 characters? Like, that's pretty kick-ass. That's something that actually held someone for 9 seasons. That's right, Red Dwarf actually had a season in 2011. That is how long this series lasted. And unlike Star Trek, where it actually had a break and moved on to a next series, This thing lasted till like 2011. That's amazing. That is absolutely blows my mind. Like I was like so shocked when I found this out. I was like, wow, I'd only seen up to like originally when I first started watching Red Dwarf was season 5 maybe, maybe 6. But like the fact that it had another series in Red Dwarf X with like most of the original cast, that's pretty cool. That's just blows my mind how cool that is. So anyway, let's start with the cast. Well, there's David Lister. Wow, he's kind of basically your punk rocker, you're kind of like your dropout school grad type guy who's basically the assistant to basically a vending machine repairman on this giant mining ship. He's the guy that was so low in rank, no one, like, literally, I think some of the machines had a higher rank than him. That's pretty bad. He basically was just your basic dropout flunky, want to be a rock star kind of guy. And he ended up sneaking a cat on the Red Dwarf, which is considered like a big no-no on their ship. So he basically gets put in stasis. What ends up happening during his point in stasis, he ends up finding out that when he finally wakes up, 3 million years has gone by, and the entire crew died way before then in a radiation leak. So basically, Dave Lister is the last person on the ship. He's by himself, and he's been drifting for 3 million years. He has like no, pretty much almost no way to get back until like later on. And that just kind of, like, again, that's kind of just wow. So at first, the series basically has him wandering around with, at first he basically comes out and finds out that one, everyone's dead, which, by the way, that they're all dead, Dave. For the love of God, they're dead, Dave. That is funny. That is class. That goes on for a while. I don't care. It's cool. I still got a good laugh on that. He basically finds out from the ship's computer, Holly, which is a very interesting character. He actually, eventually they change it to a woman, then they bring back the original Holly, which is kind of weird. I actually really wanted to kind of wicca that and find out why they did that, but I figured, what the hell? I'm just gonna leave that alone. Just like leave it to my just enjoy the show, not really get that hardcore in it. I didn't want to like spoil the series for me, any way, shape, or form. So basically, the ship's computer is basically this. It's supposed to be super intelligent, but it's been drifting for so bloody long. It's kind of lost a lot of its, luster, so to speak. So basically, he's kind of like, him and the ship and computer are wandering around. Then he runs into how I said he was the assistant? Well, then he runs into a hologram. Basically, before Voyager did the whole, wandering hologram, state your medical emergency, stuff, Red Dwarf did it first with basically the vending machine repairman, Arnie Judas Rimmer. One of the most cowardly chicken kind of character, like just this all in all slimy bootlicker type of character. Those guys that just kind of like, just freaking what the hell? I might as well just steal a British term, a smeghead. Just, yeah, that's pretty much right. That's pretty much what he is. You know, he's just that guy. he's always depressed about everything, always kind of like he's either has such an inflated ego that that completely fails him, and like anytime a fight comes, even though technically he's a hologram and can't actually be hurt, he's still kind of running most of the time, running and trying to flee and get out of the way of everything. Then you got Cat. Cat is basically the basically, how I said that Lister had had snuck a cat on board. They put the cat in the hold, and for 3 million years, the cat's kittens evolved to this like almost like James Brown kind of character that just kind of like exists. Wears like the super spicy suits, the like peaked out hair, just kind of like this insane character of like, kind of wow, kind of crazy nutso character that's all about fashion. And I guess like what would a cat do? What do cats usually do? They eat, they sleep, and they groom themselves. It's kind of like that complete exoneration of a character. Other than the fact that other than the fact that he wants to screw, he's pretty much your standard run-of-the-mill cat. He's basically the human equivalent to a cat. And there's your crew for quite a few seasons. Actually, I think Crichton doesn't show up until season 3. Now I'm going to talk about Crichton. Crichton, I believe it's Crichton 4000 series, which I might be wrong, and I apologize if I am. Even though I did see the series recently, I am kind of sleep deprived, so don't fault me on that. One of the most that's also a very interesting idea. A robot that's basically supposed to be nothing more than a cleaning droid, something that's just supposed to serve, not really supposed to do anything super extreme. A robot that's been around for so long, he's actually gained into some intelligence. He's actually gained some smarts. He's actually figured shit out. He's doing quantum mechanics. He's like putting together stuff. He's performing surgical operations. Like, how cool is that? Like, he's even actually learning human emotions, sarcasm, and all this other stuff. He's slowly, he slowly kind of like goes far beyond. Again, another thing that Star Trek Voyager took away, took from Red Dwarf. The idea of like a learning machine. Again, the hologram idea. Rolled into one. Kind of like two characters rolled into one. It's kind of like a neat kind of thing that I've actually kind of noticed this while watching the series. Wow, Star Trek actually took stuff from this, where they would take stuff from the original Star Trek series, Next Gen, Voyager, and I'm even thinking a little bit of Deep Space Nine actually stole some stuff. Like, it's kind of interesting how they kind of like weird combination of cycles that Red Dwarf and Star Trek had. Now I've been even told that at one point Red Dwarf and Star Trek were actually shot on the same lot, which is kind of cool. I kind of think that's kind of neat. I was actually told by a friend of mine. I don't know if, again, this is kind of like, kind of an interesting little thing I should actually Wicca, but again, sleep deprived, so, you know, probably doing YouTube videos is probably not a good idea to do when you're kind of like, ready to pass out at any minute. And the only thing keeping you awake is a whole lot of sugar and a whole lot of caffeine. So yeah, it's kind of one of those unusual things how they actually Red Dwarf did. Like, again, I can actually list off a bunch of things. Well, what type of things? Thanks for the Memories was actually shot, I believe, in season 2, and Clue, which actually, if you watch both episodes, there's a scary combination of them. Well, let me kind of list off in the and Thanks for the Memories. Basically, Rimmer's depressed because he really hasn't had like that hardcore like romantic relationship. He just kind of like really didn't have much for that type of life. So Lister decides to give him memories of his like memories of his like one of his like most cherished relationships he had when he was like on Earth. So he basically decide, by doing this, Rimmer kind of falls in love with this girl, kind of like wanders around, kind of like just kind of has this weird fascination. So eventually, Rimmer basically by finding out that it is actually just Dave Lister's memories, he decides to basically say, well, I don't want to have these memories. They're horrible. I don't want to live with this. So he basically asks Dave to basically set him up with, kind of like have everyone erase their memory. And by erasing all their memories and even killing out their computer, that he won't have to relive it. It's kind of funny, because by doing this, they end up screwing it up like Red Dwarf fashion. Both of them end up with broken legs, all this stuff. Two of the crew members, the cat and Lister, end up with broken legs. There's all this other type of stuff that they just absolutely screwed up. And so they end up having to because they can't remember. It's like, well, what happened? We can't remember. We've lost a couple days. So they basically have to retrace their steps and end up finding out that that was the whole idea. Like, that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. Again, next gen, the episode Clue, where Data's lying, they have to retrace. They realize that they screwed everything up. There's even mention of a broken, someone breaks limb, I think, which is which is kind of like, yeah, it's literally eerily similar. And I'm thinking Red Dwarf came. I'm thinking that season came first. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty certain that season became first. So that's kind of cool. And it also had a lot of innovative stuff too. The idea that Dave Lister, is actually not only the last man alive, even though technically they bring back the entire crew and later on, the entire crew gets revived, only to end up dying again. He ends up being the last man alive. And because he wants to preserve humanity, he ends up finding out that he actually sent his baby self back in time to actually uh, basically restart humanity in the future. So in other words, he's the last human being alive, well, the last human man alive. And because of this, he basically causes a time paradox where he exists because he basically puts himself in the past, his baby self in the past. That's kind of unique. Also, a little bit kind of funny because if you really think about it, he constantly mentions a character by the name of Chikansky. I'm probably saying that wrong, but he ends up mentioning this female crew member, which they end up running into the alternate parallel, the parallel dimension of her, and has this huge crush with her, and ends up like literally, she ends up having his baby. Because she ends up having his baby, he falls in love with her. But this is the funny thing: he still kind of flaunts after her and is still trying to find her, even in Red Dwarf X. Isn't that kind of creepy isn't that incest if you really think about it? Technically, him banging his own mother, like, wouldn't that create inbreeding? I don't know. I've been thinking about that. I thought about that, just as I was talking, I kind of thought about that. That's kind of creepy, isn't it? So that's basically kind of the whole, that is, again, that is the weirdness of Red Dwarf. The idea of this ragtag crew wandering the universe, trying to get back home. Again, another thing that Star Trek kind of took. Voyager, for example. It's kind of a cool series, and even though Star Trek had its own thing and Red Dwarf had also had its own thing. It just both series were really well done. Both series deserve mad props. except for Enterprise. Oh God, I'm gonna have Trekkies after me after saying that. Oh well. I've probably pissed off everyone with the whole Final Fantasy VII. Anyway, in closing, probably you can't deny it deserves to be considered one of the greatest sci-fi series of all time. And what else can I say about them boys on the dwarf? Anyway, so this is the end of this video, and well, hopefully you liked it. Have a good one. Bye.